This guy thought his life was over when the apocalypse hit, but he just discovered something incredible. His power isn't what anyone expected, and it's about to change everything. But before we dive into his insane abilities, let me tell you how this all started. Picture this: you're just an ordinary person living your mundane life when suddenly, boom, the world ends. Not gradually, not with warning signs, but instantly. One day you're complaining about your internet being slow, the next day monsters are literally trying to eat your face off. That's exactly what happened to our main character, and honestly, his reaction was probably the same as yours would be. Pure panic. When those first announcements hit the airwaves, nobody really believed it. I mean, who would? The government telling everyone that in 2 months, civilization would collapse and humanity would be facing extinction from creatures that make your worst nightmares look like cute puppies. Most people probably thought it was some elaborate hoax or maybe the beginning of the world's most expensive movie production. But then the monsters actually showed up. The thing about apocalypses is they don't really care about your plans. Our guy had zero preparation, zero survival skills, and zero chance of making it past day one. While everyone else was either running around screaming or trying to fight these things with kitchen knives, he made what might have been the smartest decision of his life. He locked himself in his apartment and refused to come out. Now you might think that makes him a coward, but hear me out. Sometimes the best strategy is not playing the game at all. While brave idiots were getting themselves torn apart trying to be heroes, our protagonist was sitting in his room, probably eating instant noodles and wondering if this was really how his story was going to end. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Here's where things get interesting. When the world went to hell, something weird happened to people. Some folks started developing these crazy abilities, like they were suddenly living in some kind of superhero comic book. We're talking about powers that would make Marvel jealous. Super strength, elemental control, telepathy, you name it. The catch? Most people who got these powers also got themselves killed trying to use them. But our guy? He got something different. Something that nobody else understood, including himself at first. His power seemed almost useless compared to the flashy stuff everyone else was throwing around. While other people were shooting fire from their hands or moving objects with their minds, he was stuck with what looked like the world's most disappointing superpower: the ability to make his living space completely secure from outside threats. Think about it, though. In a world where everything wants to kill you, having an absolutely impenetrable save zone isn't just useful, it's literally life-saving. His apartment became like a fortress that nothing could breach. Monsters would slam against his windows and doors, but they might as well have been trying to punch through solid steel. The downside? He couldn't leave either. It was like being in the world's most secure prison, except he was both the prisoner and the warden. For months, he survived this way, completely alone, completely cut off from the outside world. No internet, no phone service, no way to know if anyone else was even still alive. Just him, whatever food he had stockpiled, and the constant sound of monsters trying to break in. Imagine the psychological toll of that. Day after day, hearing things outside that want nothing more than to tear you apart, while you're trapped inside with nothing but your own thoughts. But here's the thing about isolation. It either breaks you completely or it forces you to adapt in ways you never thought possible. While our guy was stuck in his apartment, he started noticing things. Small changes in his abilities that didn't make sense at first. His power wasn't just about creating a safe space, it was evolving. The first sign something was different happened when one of those flying monsters decided to test itself against his window. These things were massive, with teeth that could probably bite through a car, and they were relentless. This particular creature kept ramming itself against the barrier protecting his apartment over and over again. Most people would have been terrified, but our protagonist started getting curious instead of scared. That's when he discovered something amazing. When the monster finally gave up and died from exhaustion, he felt it. Energy flowing into him like he had somehow absorbed something from the creature's death. It wasn't just experience points in some video game sense either. This was real, tangible power that he could feel changing him from the inside. This discovery changed everything. What he thought was a defensive ability that trapped him was actually something much more complex. His power wasn't just about protection, it was about control, dominance, and most importantly, growth. Every threat that came near his domain made him stronger, whether they succeeded in harming him or not. But power without purpose is just destruction waiting to happen. Our guy realized pretty quickly that sitting in his apartment forever wasn't going to solve anything. Sure, he was safe, but what kind of life was that? More importantly, what about other people? Were there other survivors out there who needed help? Was his family still alive somewhere? That's when he made a decision that would change not just his own fate, but potentially the fate of every remaining human on the planet. Instead of staying hidden in his secure little bubble, he started experimenting with his abilities, testing the limits, pushing the boundaries, and discovering that what he thought he knew about his power was just the tip of the iceberg. The first major breakthrough came when he realized he could extend his influence beyond just his immediate living space. It started small, just affecting the hallway outside his door, then gradually expanding to cover more and more area. But with each expansion came incredible pain, like his body was being torn apart and rebuilt from the inside out. The process was agonizing, but the results were undeniable. His domain wasn't just growing in size, it was growing in sophistication. What started as a simple barrier became something far more complex. He could sense everything within his territory, control various systems and functions, and most surprisingly, he could grant others limited access to his protection, but only if they met certain conditions. This is where the story gets really interesting, because our lone survivor wasn't going to stay alone for much longer. Other people had noticed his building, the one structure in the entire area that seemed completely untouched by the chaos outside. Desperate survivors started gathering, hoping to find safety, not knowing they were about to encounter someone whose power was unlike anything they could have imagined. The first group to approach his building was a family, parents with two young children who had been hiding in the ruins of their home, slowly starving to death while monsters prowled the streets outside. They had heard rumors about a safe building, a place where the creatures couldn't go, and they were willing to risk everything for even a chance at survival. When they arrived at his building, something unexpected happened. His power recognized them not as threats, but as potential allies. For the first time since the apocalypse began, our protagonist had a choice to make. He could keep his perfect isolation, staying safe but alone forever, or he could take a massive risk and let other people into his world. The decision he made in that moment would set in motion events that nobody could have predicted. Because his power wasn't just about creating a safe space for himself, it was about building something bigger, something that could potentially turn the tide in humanity's fight for survival. But first, he had to figure out exactly what he was capable of, and that process was going to be more dangerous and more amazing than anyone could have imagined. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful abilities are the ones that seem the most ordinary at first glance. Our survivor was about to discover that his true strength wasn't in fighting monsters or wielding devastating attacks. It was in something far more valuable and far more terrifying: the power to unite people, to create order from chaos, and to build a new kind of civilization from the ashes of the old one. The family stood at the edge of his territory, and something incredible happened. His power didn't just recognize them as non-threats, it actually gave him detailed information about each person: names, ages, current physical condition, even their emotional state. It was like having a supernatural scanner that could read people's entire existence in seconds. But here's where things got really wild. When he granted them citizenship in his domain, they didn't just get protection, they got access to resources that shouldn't have existed anymore. Clean water started flowing from taps that had been dry for months. Electricity hummed back to life in circuits that had been dead since the world ended. Food appeared in storage areas that had been completely empty. Now you might think this sounds too good to be true, and you'd be right to be suspicious. Because every benefit his power provided came with a price, and that price was loyalty. Not the fake kind of loyalty you give your boss when you want a raise, but deep, fundamental allegiance that went straight to the core of who these people were. The father of the family was the first to experience what this really meant. When monsters attacked the building, he found himself compelled to help defend it. Not because someone ordered him to, but because the very idea of letting harm come to the domain felt wrong on a level he couldn't even describe. His wife felt the same pull, the same instinctive need to protect what had become their sanctuary. But our protagonist was just getting started figuring out what his abilities could actually do. Each new person who joined his domain didn't just add to his population count, they added to his power. Every citizen became like a battery, feeding energy back into the system that kept everyone alive and safe. The more people he protected, the stronger his domain became, and the stronger his domain became, the more people he could protect. This created a feedback loop that was absolutely terrifying in its implications. Because if his power could grow exponentially with each new person, what would happen when he had hundreds of citizens? Thousands? What kind of force would he become when his domain covered entire city blocks instead of just one building? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Word spread among survivors about the safe building, the place where people could sleep without fear, where children could play without watching the sky for flying predators. Desperate groups started arriving daily, each one adding their own unique skills and abilities to the growing community. That's when he discovered something that changed the entire game. Some of his citizens weren't just ordinary people who had survived the apocalypse. They were awakened individuals, people who had developed their own supernatural abilities. And when they became part of his domain, their powers didn't disappear. They got stronger. A teenager who could throw objects with superhuman force found his accuracy and power increasing dramatically after joining the community. A woman who could create small barriers of energy discovered she could now protect entire groups of people. Most importantly, a portion of the experience and strength they gained from using their abilities flowed back to him. This wasn't just a safe haven anymore, it was becoming a training ground for superpowered individuals, all working together under his leadership. But leadership was something our protagonist had never wanted and definitely wasn't prepared for. Making decisions for yourself is hard enough. Making decisions that could mean life or death for dozens of other people? That's a responsibility that would crush most ordinary individuals. Except he wasn't ordinary anymore. The constant growth of his power was changing him in ways that went beyond just gaining new abilities. His mind was adapting to handle complex problems involving resource management, strategic planning, and social dynamics. He was becoming someone who could actually handle the weight of leadership, whether he wanted to or not. The first real test of his growing authority came when conflicts started arising within the community. Different groups of survivors had different ideas about how things should work. Some wanted strict military discipline, others preferred democratic decision-making. A few individuals thought they should be preparing for war against the monsters, while others believed in focusing purely on defense. These weren't just philosophical differences either. People were getting angry, forming factions, threatening to leave or force others out. The peaceful sanctuary he had created was on the verge of tearing itself apart from internal conflict. That's when his power revealed another aspect that nobody had seen coming. He could create missions for his citizens, not suggestions or requests, but actual supernatural compulsions that appeared in their minds, like quest objectives in a video game. Complete this task, receive this reward, fail and face these consequences. The system was so seamlessly integrated into reality that people accepted it as natural, even when the missions involved things that should have been impossible. The first mission he created was simple. First, work together to clear monsters from the basement levels of the building. The reward was increased access to resources and improved living conditions. The consequence for failure was losing certain privileges within the domain. Every single person who received the mission felt compelled to participate, not because they were being controlled, but because completing it felt like the right thing to do. What happened during that mission changed everything. The community that had been fracturing into hostile factions suddenly found themselves working as a coordinated team. People who had been arguing about leadership discovered they could follow orders when those orders came through the mission system. Individuals who had been too scared to fight found courage when they knew their efforts would be rewarded. But the most shocking discovery came when they actually engaged the monsters in combat. These weren't the same terrified survivors who had been running and hiding for months. They were faster, stronger, more coordinated than they had any right to be. The power boost they received from being part of his domain didn't just apply to awakened individuals. Everyone got stronger. They cleared the basement in a single coordinated assault that should have been impossible for their group. Dozens of creatures that had been lurking in the dark, waiting for a chance to break into the upper levels, were eliminated with efficiency that would have impressed military professionals. And when the mission was complete, the rewards were immediate and tangible. Living space expanded throughout the building. New facilities appeared as if they had always been there. A medical bay with equipment that worked despite the power grid being destroyed months ago. A training facility where people could practice combat techniques. Storage areas filled with supplies that definitely hadn't been there the day before. Our protagonist was starting to understand that his power wasn't just about protection or even community building. It was about reality manipulation on a scale that defied explanation. He could literally create resources from nothing, modify existing structures, and grant abilities to people that they shouldn't have been able to develop naturally. This realization brought with it a terrifying question. If he could do all of this within his domain, what were the actual limits of his power? Could he expand his influence to cover entire cities? Could he grant superhuman abilities to thousands of people? Could he potentially reshape the world according to his will? The answer would have to wait because his growing community was attracting attention from forces that made the ordinary monsters look like minor inconveniences. Other groups of survivors had noticed the impossible prosperity of his building. Some wanted to join, but others saw it as a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be conquered. Military remnants, criminal organizations, and even other awakened individuals with their own agendas were converging on his location. Some came seeking alliance, others came seeking domination, and a few came with intentions that were far more sinister than simple conquest. The first major external threat arrived without warning. A group calling themselves the Iron Wolves had been raiding survivor settlements throughout the region, taking supplies and forcing capable individuals to join their ranks. They had vehicles, military-grade weapons, and awakened leaders whose powers were specifically designed for combat and intimidation. When they surrounded his building and demanded surrender, our protagonist faced his first real test as a leader. He could try to negotiate, potentially saving lives but showing weakness that would attract more predators. He could fight, risking everything he had built for the chance to eliminate the threat completely. Or he could try something that nobody would expect. He could make them an offer they literally couldn't refuse. The confrontation that followed would prove that his power had grown far beyond simple territory control. What started as a potential siege turned into something that redefined what was possible in the post-apocalyptic world. Because when you can offer people everything they need to survive and prosper, when you can grant them abilities they never dreamed of having, and when you can create a life that's genuinely better than what existed before, the world ended. Even the most hardened raiders start reconsidering their life choices. The leader of the Iron Wolves stepped forward, his scarred face twisted into what he probably thought was an intimidating sneer. This guy had clearly been running his little empire through fear and violence for months, and he expected our protagonist to cower like every other survivor he'd encountered. What he got instead was an invitation to come inside and see what real power looked like. Now, most people would call this move absolutely insane. You don't invite armed raiders into your sanctuary and expect things to go well. But our guy had figured out something that changed the entire equation. His domain didn't just protect people from external threats. It could influence anyone who entered with hostile intentions, gradually shifting their perspective until cooperation seemed like the most logical choice. The moment the Iron Wolves crossed the threshold of his building, something started happening to them. It wasn't mind control or anything that obvious. It was subtler, like walking into a room where everyone's speaking a different language and slowly realizing you understand every word. The anger and aggression they'd brought with them began dissolving, replaced by curiosity about how this place could exist when everywhere else was ruins and death. Their leader tried to maintain his tough guy persona, demanding to know where the weapons were hidden, how many fighters were stationed throughout the building, what kind of defenses they'd have to overcome. But his questions got quieter with each passing minute as he started noticing details that didn't make sense. Clean hallways in a world where soap was worth more than gold, children playing games instead of huddling in terror, adults who looked healthy and well-fed rather than desperate and starving. Then came the moment that broke his worldview completely. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, walked right up to this battle-hardened raider who'd probably killed dozens of people and offered to share her snack with him. Not because she was trying to bribe him or because an adult told her to, but because in this community, sharing with newcomers was just what you did. The psychological impact was devastating. This guy had spent months convincing himself that humanity was finished, that the only way to survive was through violence and taking what you needed from weaker people. And here was a child proving that civilization could still exist, that people could still be kind, that there was another way to live even in this nightmare world. But our protagonist wasn't content to just convert the raiders through emotional manipulation. He had a much more practical demonstration in mind. He offered them a deal that was simultaneously generous and terrifying in its implications. Join the community permanently, accept the same citizenship terms as everyone else, and receive benefits that would make their current lifestyle look like primitive scavenging. To prove his point, he activated one of his newer abilities. The building around them began changing, walls shifting and expanding to create additional living spaces. Furniture materialized in empty rooms. A full armory appeared in what had been a storage closet, stocked with weapons that were somehow better maintained than anything the raiders had brought with them. The Iron Wolves watched in stunned silence as their host casually reshaped reality around them. This wasn't some parlor trick or illusion. The changes were permanent, solid, completely real. They were witnessing power on a scale that made their own abilities look like children's toys. Their leader, a man who'd built his reputation on never showing weakness, actually stumbled backward when he realized what he was seeing. He'd encountered other awakened individuals before, fought them, killed some of them, but nothing had prepared him for someone who could alter the fundamental structure of reality just by willing it to happen. That's when our protagonist revealed the true scope of what he was offering. Membership in his community didn't just mean safety and resources. It meant access to a system that could enhance their existing abilities or grant new ones to people who'd never awakened at all. The teenager who could throw objects with superhuman force? He'd started as a completely ordinary kid with no powers whatsoever. To demonstrate, he selected one of the newer raiders, a woman who'd been skeptical throughout the entire conversation. With her permission, he granted her temporary access to an enhanced reflexes ability. The change was immediate and obvious. Her movements became fluid and precise, her reaction time increased dramatically, and most importantly, she could feel the difference in every fiber of her being. The psychological effect on the group was exactly what he'd intended. These weren't desperate survivors anymore. They were people being offered genuine improvement to their lives, the chance to become more than they'd ever imagined possible. The woman who'd received the temporary enhancement was already asking what she'd need to do to make it permanent. But here's where things got really interesting. The Iron Wolves weren't just random bandits. They'd been organized, disciplined, with their own internal hierarchy and command structure. Their leader wasn't just some thug who'd gotten lucky. He was a tactical thinker who understood strategy and resource management, exactly the kind of person our protagonist needed to help manage his rapidly growing community. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything that had happened in the post-apocalyptic world. Instead of one group conquering another, they were discussing merger terms. The Iron Wolves had vehicles, weapons, knowledge about other survivor groups, and most importantly, they had people with combat experience who could help train the community's defenders. In exchange, they'd receive citizenship in a domain that offered security, resources, and personal enhancement beyond anything they'd dreamed of. Their leader would become part of the governing council, his tactical expertise valued rather than feared. His people would integrate into the community rather than being absorbed or eliminated. The deal was struck with handshakes rather than bloodshed, but the real test came when it was time to implement the terms. Converting hostile raiders into productive citizens isn't exactly something you can find a guidebook for, especially when supernatural powers are involved. Our protagonist was about to learn whether his influence could really change people at a fundamental level, or if he just invited a bunch of wolves into his sheep pen. The answer became clear within hours. The former raiders didn't just adapt to community life, they excelled at it. Their combat experience made them natural choices for security roles. Their knowledge of the outside world proved invaluable for planning supply runs and defensive strategies. Most importantly, their presence sent a message to other potential threats that this community wasn't just a gathering of helpless survivors. But the integration process revealed something unexpected about how his power actually worked. The loyalty system wasn't just about emotional attachment or psychological conditioning. It was creating genuine bonds between people, connections that went deeper than simple friendship or professional relationships. The former enemies were becoming actual family members, bound together by shared purpose and mutual dependence. This discovery opened up entirely new possibilities for community expansion. If his domain could convert hostile forces into loyal citizens, what was stopping him from actively seeking out other groups to integrate? Instead of waiting for threats to find him, he could go looking for opportunities to grow stronger. The first test of this new strategy came when scouts reported a large group of survivors holed up in a shopping mall about 10 kilometers away. They'd fortified the building and were apparently doing well for themselves, but they were also sitting on resources that could benefit both communities. More importantly, they had people with specialized skills that his growing city desperately needed. The expedition he organized to make contact was unlike anything that had been attempted since the apocalypse began. Instead of a raiding party or a military force, he sent what could only be described as an embassy. Representatives from his community, including former Iron Wolves who could speak the language of hardened survivors, carrying offers of trade, alliance, and eventual integration. The shopping mall group's response was predictably suspicious. In their experience, other communities meant competition for scarce resources, potential threats to be eliminated, or targets to be raided. The idea that someone wanted to form mutually beneficial relationships was so foreign, they initially assumed it was some kind of elaborate trap. But our protagonist had learned something important about human psychology during his months of isolation and community building. People don't just want to survive, they want to live. They want purpose, progress, hope for a future that's better than their present. When you can offer all of those things backed by demonstrable power, even the most cynical survivors start paying attention. The negotiation process took weeks, but the results were worth the patience. The shopping mall group didn't just agree to trade relationships, they voted to relocate entirely, bringing their people and resources to join the growing city. Their leader, a former retail manager who had proven surprisingly effective at organizing defensive operations, became another valuable addition to the governing council. With each successful integration, our protagonist's power grew exponentially. His domain expanded to cover multiple city blocks. The population swelled to over 1,000 citizens. Resource generation increased to levels that seemed impossible given the destroyed state of the outside world. Most importantly, the community was developing its own culture, its own identity that went beyond simple survival. But growth on this scale attracted attention from forces that made raiders and desperate survivors look like minor inconveniences. Government remnants, military installations, and worst of all, other awakened individuals with their own ambitions for rebuilding civilization according to their vision. The first major challenge came from what remained of the regional military command. They'd established their own settlement in a fortified base about 50 kilometers away, and they weren't happy about reports of a civilian community that seemed to be thriving while their own people struggled with basic necessities. In their view, all survivors should be under military protection and military authority. The delegation they sent was professional, polite, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. They offered protection in exchange for integration into their command structure. Citizens would become civilians under military law. Resources would be managed through military logistics. The awakened individuals in the community would be recruited into special forces units. It was a generous offer by post-apocalyptic standards. It was also completely unacceptable to someone who'd built his power on the principle of protecting people's freedom and autonomy. The military's idea of protection involved strict hierarchy, limited personal liberty, and subordination to authority figures who hadn't proven themselves capable of creating anything better than armed camps. Our protagonist's response was diplomatic but firm. He appreciated their offer, but his community was doing quite well on its own. They were always open to trade relationships and mutual defense agreements, but integration under external authority was not something they were willing to consider. The military delegation left peacefully, but everyone knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. Military commanders don't typically accept rejection from civilian authorities, especially when those civilians are sitting on resources and territory that could significantly improve military capabilities. The question wasn't whether conflict would come, but when and in what form. The answer came sooner than expected, and it arrived in a way that nobody had anticipated. Instead of direct military action, the base commander decided to test the community's defenses through proxy forces. Mercenary groups, raider bands, and other hostile elements suddenly found themselves with detailed intelligence about the city's layout, defensive positions, and daily routines. The attack started small, probing raids designed to test response times and defensive capabilities. Harassment operations meant to disrupt daily life and lower morale. Propaganda efforts aimed at convincing citizens that military protection was preferable to their current situation. But the military commanders had made a crucial error in their assessment. They were thinking like pre-apocalypse authorities dealing with a standard civilian population. They hadn't accounted for the fact that every single person in the community was enhanced by supernatural power, trained in combat techniques, and bound together by loyalty that went deeper than normal human relationships. The first major assault was supposed to be overwhelming. Three different raider groups attacking simultaneously from different directions, supported by long-range fire from military weapons, coordinated to prevent effective defense and force surrender through sheer numbers. What actually happened was a demonstration of why you don't pick fights with people whose abilities you don't understand. The attackers found themselves facing defenders who moved faster than normal humans, hit harder than should have been possible, and coordinated their responses with precision that would have impressed professional soldiers. More importantly, they were fighting people who genuinely believed they were protecting something worth dying for. Not just their own lives, but a way of life that proved civilization could be rebuilt without sacrificing everything that made humanity worth preserving. The battle was over in less than an hour. The casualties were almost entirely on the attacking side. The few survivors retreated carrying reports that probably sounded like fantasy to their commanders. Stories about ordinary-looking people performing impossible feats, about defenses that adapted in real time to counter different threats, about a community that fought like a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. But our protagonist knew this victory was just the beginning of a much larger conflict. The military base wasn't going to accept defeat from a civilian community, and they had resources that could pose serious threats even to his enhanced defenders. More importantly, word of the battle would spread to other potential enemies, who might decide that his growing city represented a threat to their own ambitions. The post-apocalyptic world was about to discover what happened when someone with the power to reshape reality decided that humanity deserved better than mere survival. The real challenge wasn't the military's conventional forces, it was what came after. Because when you start winning battles against organized opposition, you send a message to every other power player in the region that you're either a potential ally or a threat that needs to be eliminated. Our protagonist was about to learn that his little sanctuary had grown beyond the point where hiding was an option. Within days of the failed assault, representatives from settlements across the entire region started arriving. Some came seeking alliance. Others came to assess whether this new power was something they needed to worry about. A few came with offers that sounded generous but carried implications that made his skin crawl. The most disturbing visitor was a woman who introduced herself as the administrator of the Northern Coalition. She looked perfectly ordinary, the kind of person you'd expect to see managing an office before the world ended. But there was something in her eyes that suggested she'd adapted to the post-apocalyptic landscape in ways that went far beyond simple survival. Her proposal was elegant in its simplicity. The coalition controlled 17 different settlements, managing resources and population through what she called efficient allocation protocols. They offered membership as an autonomous zone, meaning his community would maintain internal control while contributing to the greater collective good. The terms seemed reasonable until she started explaining the details. Population caps to prevent resource strain, mandatory relocation of specialists to where they were most needed, regular inspections to ensure compliance with coalition standards. Most importantly, integration of awakened individuals into the coalition's Special Forces program. It was slavery dressed up in bureaucratic language, and she presented it like she was offering him a promotion. The administrator clearly expected gratitude for the opportunity to join her well-organized system of controlled communities. Our protagonist's response was polite but unambiguous. His people had chosen their way of life, and they weren't interested in being managed by external authorities, no matter how efficient those authorities claimed to be. The administrator's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her expression before she thanked him for his time and departed. That night, he called an emergency meeting with his governing council. The former raider leader, the shopping mall manager, and several other community leaders gathered to discuss what everyone knew was coming. The administrator hadn't made threats, but her parting words about the importance of cooperation in difficult times carried unmistakable implications. The council's discussion revealed just how much the community had changed from its early days as a simple survivor refuge. These weren't desperate people clinging to safety anymore. They were citizens of something new, something that represented hope for genuine human progress, even in the ruins of civilization. And they were willing to fight for that vision. But fighting the coalition would be different from dealing with raiders or even military remnants. This was an organization that controlled thousands of people across hundreds of square kilometers. They had resources, infrastructure, and most importantly, they had experience managing post-apocalyptic politics. If they decided his community was a threat, the response would be systematic and overwhelming. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of the newer citizens, a former communications specialist who joined after the Iron Wolves integration, suggested that maybe the problem wasn't military at all. Maybe it was about information and influence. The coalition maintained control through careful management of resources and population, but they also relied on something more fundamental. They had convinced people that their system was the only viable option for long-term survival. Every settlement that joined them did so because they believed the alternative was slow starvation or violent destruction. But what if there was proof that alternatives could not only survive but actually thrive? What if other communities could see that cooperation didn't require surrendering autonomy, that prosperity was possible without accepting authoritarian management? This idea sparked something that would transform the entire regional power structure. Instead of preparing for defensive war against the coalition, our protagonist decided to challenge their fundamental premise. He would prove that his model of community development was superior by helping other settlements achieve the same level of success. The first target was a struggling farming community about 30 kilometers to the east. They'd been barely hanging on, producing just enough food to feed themselves while living in constant fear of raider attacks. The coalition had made several offers to relocate them to more secure territory, but the farmers were reluctant to abandon the land they'd worked so hard to defend. Instead of sending military advisors or resource shipments, our protagonist sent something unprecedented. A small team of citizens whose job was to share knowledge, techniques, and most importantly, hope. They brought seeds that grew faster and stronger than normal crops. They shared defensive strategies that didn't require military-grade weapons. Most importantly, they demonstrated that small communities could prosper without surrendering their independence. The transformation was remarkable. Within months, the farming community was not only self-sufficient, but actually producing surplus food that they could trade with other settlements. Their defensive capabilities improved to the point where raiders stopped considering them viable targets. Most importantly, their success attracted other struggling communities who wanted to learn how they'd achieved such rapid improvement. Word spread faster than anyone expected. Communities throughout the region started requesting assistance, advice, and alliance with the growing network of independent settlements. The coalition's carefully maintained control began showing cracks as member communities started questioning whether submission to central authority was really necessary for survival. The administrator's response was swift and brutal. Communities that showed too much interest in the independence model found themselves facing sudden resource shortages. Technical problems began affecting their infrastructure. Most ominously, raider attacks increased dramatically in areas where coalition control was weakening. But the coalition had made the same mistake as the military commanders. They were fighting the last war instead of adapting to new realities. Their intimidation tactics worked against isolated, desperate communities. They were much less effective against settlements that had formed mutual defense pacts and resource-sharing agreements. The first major test came when a coalition enforcement team arrived at the farming community with orders to relocate the population to a more secure facility. The farmers politely declined, pointing out that their current arrangement was working quite well. The enforcement team insisted, explaining that individual communities couldn't be allowed to make decisions that affected regional stability. That's when they discovered that the farming community wasn't alone anymore. Representatives from 6 different allied settlements were present for the discussion, along with communication links to several more. The enforcement team found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by people who'd been specifically trained to handle exactly this type of situation. More importantly, they were facing opponents who genuinely believed they were fighting for something better than mere survival. The farmers weren't just defending their land. They were defending the principle that people should have the right to determine their own fate, even in a world gone mad. The standoff lasted for hours, with neither side willing to back down. The enforcement team had orders to complete their mission, but they were also smart enough to recognize that using force would likely result in casualties they couldn't afford. The allied communities had the numbers and defensive advantages, but they also knew that violence would give the coalition justification for massive retaliation. The resolution came when our protagonist arrived personally to mediate the situation. His reputation had grown to the point where his mere presence changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Here was someone who'd built a thriving city from nothing, who'd converted enemies into allies, who'd proven that cooperation could achieve what force could not. His proposal was characteristically elegant. The coalition team could return to their superiors with a report that the relocation had been deemed unnecessary due to improved security conditions. The farming community would continue their current operations while maintaining friendly relations with all regional powers. Most importantly, both sides would establish formal communication channels to prevent future misunderstandings. It was diplomacy at its finest, but everyone understood the real message. The coalition's monopoly on regional authority was over. There was now an alternative power structure that could offer communities genuine choice about their future, and that alternative was growing stronger every day. The administrator's response was predictable. If she couldn't control the situation through political pressure, she'd escalate to direct confrontation. Within weeks, coalition forces began massing near the borders of Allied settlements. Supply convoys started experiencing mysterious delays. Communication networks faced unprecedented technical difficulties. But our protagonist had been preparing for this moment since the first diplomatic contact with the coalition. His network of allied communities wasn't just a political arrangement. It was a carefully constructed system designed to withstand exactly this type of pressure. Each settlement had been enhanced with defensive capabilities that went far beyond normal human engineering. Resource production had been optimized to the point where external trade was helpful but not essential. Most importantly, every community was connected through communication and transportation networks that the coalition couldn't easily disrupt. The war that followed wasn't fought with armies or massive battles. It was a conflict of systems, ideologies, and ultimately human nature itself. The coalition represented the old way of thinking, the belief that survival required hierarchy, control, and submission to authority. The allied communities represented something new, the possibility that people could cooperate freely while maintaining their individual dignity and autonomy. The first major engagement happened when coalition forces attempted to blockade trade routes between allied settlements. They expected to strangle the communities economically, forcing them to accept coalition terms or face starvation. What they encountered instead was a network so resilient and adaptable that cutting off one route simply redirected traffic through 3 others. More importantly, the blockade attempts revealed something that shocked coalition leadership. The allied communities weren't just defending themselves, they were actively expanding, bringing new settlements into their network faster than the coalition could isolate them. Each successful integration made the network stronger and more capable of resisting external pressure. Each failed coalition intimidation attempt demonstrated to neutral communities that there really was an alternative to submission. The momentum was clearly shifting away from centralized control toward voluntary cooperation. The administrator's final gambit was as desperate as it was dangerous. If political pressure and economic warfare couldn't restore coalition dominance, she would resort to direct military action. Not the limited enforcement operations they'd used before, but total war aimed at destroying the Allied network completely. The assault force she assembled was the largest military operation since the early days after the apocalypse. Thousands of fighters drawn from every coalition settlement, supported by pre-war military equipment that had been carefully maintained and stockpiled. The plan was to simultaneously attack every major allied community their defenses before, overwhelming they could coordinate a response. It was a sound strategy based on conventional military thinking. It was also doomed to failure because it fundamentally misunderstood what the Allied network had become. This wasn't a collection of separate communities that happened to work together. It was something entirely new, a form of human organization that combined individual autonomy with collective capability in ways that traditional power structures couldn't comprehend or counter. When the coalition assault began, it faced opposition that seemed to violate the basic laws of warfare. Defenders who fought with inhuman speed and strength. Defensive positions that adapted in real time to counter different types of attacks. Most impossibly, coordination between settlements that was so precise by a single mind. The reality it seemed like the entire network was controlled was even more impressive than the appearance. Our protagonist's power had evolved far beyond simple territory control. His domain now extended across the entire Allied network, connecting every settlement through bonds that went deeper than communication or mutual interest. When one community was threatened, every Allied settlement felt it as a personal attack on their own families. The coalition forces found themselves fighting not just individual communities, but an entire civilization that had learned to function as a single organism while preserving the individuality of its components. It was humanity's next evolutionary step, and it was beautiful to behold. The war ended not with surrender or negotiation, but with something unprecedented in post-apocalyptic politics. Coalition settlements began defecting en masse, their populations voting to join the Allied network rather than continue supporting a system that offered only survival in exchange for freedom. The administrator's final transmission was a mixture of rage and bewilderment. She couldn't understand how her efficient, well-organized system had been defeated by what she saw as chaotic cooperation between undisciplined communities. Her last words before communication was severed were a promise that this rebellion against proper authority wouldn't be allowed to spread beyond the region. But it was already too late for containment. Word of the Allied network's success had reached communities hundreds of kilometers away. Delegations were arriving daily, seeking to learn how they too could build something better than mere survival. The model was spreading faster than any military force could stop it. Our protagonist stood on the observation deck of his city's central tower, watching the sun set over territory that stretched to the horizon. Everywhere he looked, lights were coming on in communities that had chosen cooperation over submission, hope over despair, progress over mere survival. The power he'd unlocked wasn't about controlling people or dominating territory. It was about giving humanity the tools to rebuild itself into something worthy of the intelligence and creativity that had made civilization possible in the first place. And this was just the beginning. Because there were reports coming in from other regions, other continents even, about similar awakenings happening all over the world. People who discovered that the apocalypse wasn't an ending, but an opportunity to start over, to build something better than what had existed before. The final phase of humanity's transformation was about to begin, and he was ready to help guide it toward a future that would make the old world look primitive by comparison. The transformation wasn't limited to his immediate region anymore. Reports were flooding in from across the continent about similar phenomena occurring everywhere. Communities that had been struggling to survive were suddenly thriving in ways that defied explanation. Leaders were emerging with abilities that seemed to bend reality itself, and they were all following patterns remarkably similar to what he'd developed. But here's where things got really interesting. These weren't isolated incidents or coincidences. There was something connecting all of these awakened leaders, some kind of network that existed beyond normal communication channels. When he focused his enhanced senses, he could actually feel them out there. Dozens, maybe hundreds of individuals who'd unlocked powers similar to his own, each one building their own version of a better world. The first direct contact came through a method he never could have anticipated. A woman simply appeared in his office one day, materializing out of thin air like she'd stepped through an invisible doorway. She introduced herself as Elena, and she represented what she called the Continental Assembly, a loose confederation of awakened leaders who'd been monitoring each other's progress. Elena's abilities were impressive even by post-apocalyptic standards. She could travel instantly between any locations she'd previously visited, making her the perfect messenger for a network of communities spread across thousands of kilometers. More importantly, she brought news that changed everything our protagonist thought he knew about what was happening to the world. The awakening wasn't random. It wasn't some cosmic accident that had granted random people supernatural abilities during humanity's darkest hour. According to Elena, it was evolution in action, the species adapting to survive in conditions that would have destroyed normal human civilization. The people who developed these reality-shaping powers weren't anomalies. They were humanity's future. This revelation reframed everything that had happened since the apocalypse began. The monsters, the collapse of governments, the desperate struggle for survival, it had all been a catalyst. A pressure cooker designed to force human evolution in directions that never would have been possible under normal circumstances. The individuals who had survived and thrived weren't just lucky or clever. They were genuinely different from baseline humanity. Elena's invitation to join the Continental Assembly came with detailed information about what other awakened leaders had accomplished. There was a man in the Eastern Territories who'd learned to control weather patterns, ending droughts and floods across entire provinces. A woman in the South had developed the ability to accelerate plant growth. turning barren wastelands into fertile agricultural zones within months. Most impressively, there was someone calling himself the architect, who'd rebuilt an entire city using nothing but his will and raw materials scavenged from ruins. His construction projects defied physics in ways that made our protagonist's building modifications look simple by comparison. Skyscrapers that stood without foundations, bridges that spanned impossible distances, infrastructure that maintained itself without human intervention. The assembly's purpose was coordination and knowledge sharing between these new leaders. They discovered that their abilities grew stronger through interaction with others who possessed similar powers. More importantly, they'd learned that the challenges facing humanity were too large for any single community to handle alone, no matter how advanced their leaders' capabilities. Climate disruption from all the destruction was threatening agricultural zones across multiple continents. Massive monster populations were migrating between regions, overwhelming local defenses. Most critically, there were signs that the evolutionary pressure that had created awakened leaders was also affecting other species, potentially creating threats that even enhanced human communities couldn't handle. Elena's presentation included footage that made his previous battles look like minor skirmishes. Creatures the size of buildings, moving in coordinated swarms that suggested intelligence far beyond what they'd encountered before. Entire cities evacuated because something too large to fight had claimed the territory. Environmental disasters that seemed to be getting worse rather than better as time passed. The message was clear. Individual communities, no matter how successful, weren't enough anymore. Humanity needed to start thinking and acting as a species again, but with capabilities that far exceeded anything from the old world. The Continental Assembly was proposing nothing less than a complete restructuring of human civilization around the awakened leaders and their enhanced communities. Our protagonist's response was characteristically thoughtful. He appreciated the invitation and the information, but he needed to understand exactly what joining the assembly would mean for his people. Elena's answer revealed the true scope of what they were attempting to build. The assembly wasn't trying to create another hierarchical power structure like the old governments or organizations like the coalition. Instead, they were developing what she called a distributed leadership model. Each awakened leader would maintain complete autonomy over their own territory and people, but they'd share resources, knowledge, and defensive capabilities through the network. When one region faced threats beyond their ability to handle, other assembly members would provide assistance. When someone developed new techniques or technologies, that information would be freely shared throughout the network. Most importantly, major decisions affecting multiple regions would be made through consensus, rather than top-down authority. It was democracy reimagined for a post-apocalyptic world, and it addressed most of his concerns about joining larger organizations. His people would maintain their freedom and self-determination while gaining access to resources and capabilities that individual communities could never develop alone. The first test of this cooperation came sooner than anyone expected. Elena had barely finished explaining the assembly's structure when emergency alerts started flooding in through the network. Something massive was moving through the central territories, destroying everything in its path. The few survivor reports described it as a living mountain, covered in what looked like organic armor, and surrounded by smaller creatures that seemed to be extensions of its body. Traditional military responses had been completely ineffective. Conventional weapons couldn't penetrate its defenses, and it was too large for any single community to evacuate from its path. Worse, it seemed to be heading directly toward one of the most successful assembly territories, a region that housed nearly 50,000 survivors. This was exactly the kind of crisis the assembly had been formed to address. Elena immediately began coordinating response efforts, connecting awakened leaders across thousands of kilometers in real-time planning sessions. Our protagonist found himself part of a strategic discussion involving individuals whose abilities complemented each other in ways that opened up entirely new possibilities. The weather controller could create atmospheric disturbances to slow the creature's advance. The growth accelerator could rapidly establish barrier forests to channel its movement toward more favorable terrain. The architect could construct temporary fortifications designed to withstand impacts that would level normal buildings. But the real breakthrough came when they started combining their abilities in ways none of them had attempted before. Our protagonist's domain expansion could provide a stable base of operations for other awakened leaders, allowing them to coordinate their powers with precision impossible at long distances. Elena's teleportation could move resources and personnel instantly between different positions. The plan they developed was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. Instead of trying to fight or stop the creature, they would redirect it toward an uninhabited region where its destructive capabilities wouldn't threaten human settlements. This required precise coordination between multiple awakened leaders, environmental manipulation on a continental scale, and timing that had no margin for error. The operation began with our protagonist expanding his domain to create a series of waypoints across hundreds of kilometers. Each waypoint became a miniature version of his home territory, complete with enhanced communication, resource generation, and defensive capabilities. This network provided the infrastructure needed for the other assembly members to coordinate their efforts. The weather controller established a series of storm systems designed to create pressure differentials that would encourage the creature to alter its course. The growth accelerator began rapidly establishing vegetation barriers that would channel movement in desired directions. The architect started constructing what he called influence structures, buildings designed not for human habitation, but to affect the behavior of large creatures through environmental psychology. Meanwhile, Elena coordinated the evacuation of potential target areas, moving entire populations to safety in a matter of hours. Her teleportation abilities allowed her to relocate thousands of people faster than any conventional transportation method, while our protagonist's domain network provided temporary shelter and resources for displaced communities. The execution of the plan was a masterpiece of supernatural coordination. As the creature approached each carefully prepared waypoint, it encountered conditions that made continuing in its original direction increasingly difficult while making the desired alternate route seem more attractive. Storm systems created headwinds from one direction and tailwinds from another. Rapidly grown forests blocked some paths while leaving others clear. Architectural constructions generated subtle environmental cues that influenced the creature's instinctive responses. Most importantly, the entire operation was coordinated through the domain network, allowing real-time adjustments as the creature's behavior provided new information about its motivations and capabilities. What had seemed like mindless destruction revealed itself to be purposeful movement towards some specific destination, possibly driven by evolutionary imperatives beyond human understanding. The redirection was successful beyond their most optimistic projections. Not only did they guide the creature away from populated areas, but they learned valuable information about its behavior patterns and apparent objectives. This knowledge would be crucial for handling similar threats in the future, because Elena's intelligence network suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. The success of the operation proved that the assembly model could work on the scale needed to address post-apocalyptic challenges. More importantly, it demonstrated that awakened leaders could combine their abilities in ways that multiplied their individual capabilities exponentially. The whole really was greater than the sum of its parts. But the creature redirection also revealed something troubling about the current state of the world. The entity hadn't been moving randomly or responding to immediate threats. It was migrating, following some kind of instinctive pattern that suggested environmental changes were driving large-scale movements of previously dormant species. Elena's analysis of global patterns painted a picture that was simultaneously hopeful and terrifying. The awakened leaders and their enhanced communities were successfully rebuilding human civilization in scattered pockets across the world. But the same evolutionary pressures that had created these new human capabilities were also affecting other species in ways that could pose existential threats to recovery efforts. The Assembly's next major initiative involved establishing a global monitoring network to track these emerging threats and opportunities. Our protagonist's domain expansion abilities made him a natural choice for creating the infrastructure needed to support this network. His territories could serve as communication hubs, research stations, and staging areas for response operations. The expansion process required pushing his abilities far beyond anything he'd attempted before. Creating waypoints across hundreds of kilometers had been challenging but manageable. Establishing a network that spanned continents would require fundamental changes to how his power operated, possibly pushing him past the threshold into entirely new categories of capability. The first step was learning to delegate aspects of his domain management to trusted subordinates. Instead of directly controlling every aspect of his territory, he began training selected citizens to serve as local administrators with limited versions of his abilities. These individuals could handle routine operations while he focused on expansion and network coordination. The delegation process revealed another layer to his power's evolution. The people he granted administrative abilities didn't just receive enhanced authority within his domain. They developed genuine supernatural capabilities of their own, becoming awakened individuals in their own right. The loyalty and trust that bound them to his community seemed to facilitate their own evolutionary development. This discovery had profound implications for the future of human development. If awakened leaders could actively facilitate the evolution of others, the percentage of enhanced individuals in the population could increase dramatically over time. Instead of awakened leaders being rare exceptions, they could become the foundation for an entirely new phase of human civilization. The global monitoring network took months to establish, but the results exceeded everyone's expectations. The combination of our protagonist's domain expansion, Elena's teleportation network, and contributions from dozens of other awakened leaders created a communication and coordination system that surpassed anything that had existed before the apocalypse. Information flowed instantly between communities separated by thousands of kilometers. Resources could be redistributed in response to local crises faster than pre-war government agencies could have managed. Most importantly, threats could be identified and addressed while they were still manageable rather than waiting until they became regional disasters. The first major test of the global network came when monitoring stations detected coordinated movement patterns among monster populations across 3 different continents. The creatures weren't just migrating randomly anymore. They were organizing, possibly responding to some kind of collective intelligence that had emerged from their individual evolutionary adaptations. The response operation that followed dwarfed the creature redirection in both scope and complexity. Dozens of awakened leaders coordinated their efforts across time zones and continental distances, sharing information and resources through the network our protagonist had helped create. Weather patterns were manipulated simultaneously on multiple continents. Environmental barriers were established across thousands of kilometers of territory. Entire regions were evacuated and resettled in operations that involved moving millions of people. But the most significant aspect of the operation wasn't its scale or success. It was what happened to the participating awakened leaders during the coordination process. Extended cooperation at this level seemed to trigger another phase of evolution, pushing their abilities into entirely new territories. Our protagonist found that his domain expansion capabilities had grown to the point where he could maintain awareness and limited control over territory spanning entire continents. Elena's teleportation evolved to include temporal displacement, allowing her to move people and resources not just through space but through time. The weather controller developed the ability to influence solar radiation itself, effectively gaining limited control over climate on a planetary scale. And there you have it. From a scared guy hiding in his apartment to literally reshaping human civilization across entire continents. This manhwa shows us that sometimes the most broken-looking powers turn out to be the most incredible ones. Our protagonist went from ultimate shut-in to planetary coordinator, proving that evolution doesn't always look like what you'd expect. If you enjoyed this wild ride through supernatural city building and continental warfare, smash that like button and let me know what other manhwa recaps you want to see next.